Start off by saying good afternoon, everyone. My name's Aziz. I am head of school partnerships here at the Brilliant Club, and it's really wonderful that you can all join us this afternoon on this very rainy afternoon in London, at least, to kind of discover and hear more about some practical tips for teaching critical thinking. And it's great to see that we've got colleagues joining us from, right the way across the UK, but also further afield, as I can see coming through in the chat, which is fantastic. And I think we all agree that critical thinking is definitely one of the top goals of education, and arguably now more than ever, it really is crucial that young people can learn to think critically. Before I hand over to Dr. Lauren Bellaera, who is the Brilliant Club's very own Research and Impact Director, I just wanted to cover some of the house rules for this session. So please do keep your microphones muted. There may be opportunities to kind of bring you in to ask questions, at which point we'll ask you to unmute your mics and ask those questions directly. But for the time being, please do keep all microphones muted. There is also the chat function, as I can see that some of you have already been acquainted with. If you haven't already, please do introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know where you're dialing in from today. It's always lovely to kind of hear where our guests are joining from. The chat function will also be an opportunity throughout the course of the presentation to kind of post any reflections, any thoughts, any comments as we go. We will try and come back. There will be time for questions at the end. But like I said, please do kind of post your thoughts and reflections as we go through the chat function. And there's a chat kind of icon at the bottom of your screens if you hover over the screen in front of you. This meeting is being recorded, and that's purely for the purpose of sharing the recording with delegates and colleagues who weren't able to join us this afternoon, as well as with yourselves. And as I mentioned, there will be time for questions at the end, so we will come back to those at the end of the presentation. And we'll also be sharing a copy of the slides from today's presentation as well. There will be a few polls that we post up throughout the course of the presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to complete them. And finally, we will be sharing a short feedback form following this presentation, and we really appreciate your thoughts and reflections as we do kind of take those on board for any future events that we do. Lovely, and that's all from me for the time being. So without further ado, I will pass over to Lauren, who's going to take the presentation away. Laura.
Lovely, thank you very much, Susan. It's also fantastic to see so many people on this call this afternoon. So as Susan has already mentioned, really the focus of this session is talking about the hot topic, which is critical thinking, and really sort of focusing on those practical tips for thinking about how we can really support critical thinking in a classroom context. In terms of the sort of the structure of the presentation, so really we're going to be focusing on three key questions. So firstly, why is critical thinking important? What is critical thinking, which is really an essential step if we're then going to be teaching it to students and teaching it to young people. And then kind of the crux of the presentation, and perhaps what many people are here for, is what is the best way or best ways to be teaching critical thinking practically. And then what we will do is link it to some of our wider work at the Brilliant Club. So I'll speak sort of very, very briefly about how we embed some sort of critical thinking practices and critical thinking teaching strategies into our programmes at the Brilliant Club. And then I'll hand back to Aziz, who will also then give a bit of a wider overview of the programme. And then also, as has already been mentioned, we will definitely have time for questions at the end of the session. So please, as we go through, feel free to put things into the chat. Okay, so to begin with, I wanted really just to give a very brief overview of my interest in critical thinking and really to explain why I'm talking about this topic in particular to all of you. So my interest really is from a research perspective. So I've researched critical thinking at a number of universities, and in particular, I'm really interested in understanding the different kinds of definitions of critical thinking and thinking about how that practically connects through to how you teach critical thinking, and then also thinking about the critical thinking activities which are most important. I've thought about it both in a higher education context and also in a school context. So I'll be presenting a mixture of stuff today. So both to do with higher education and then also connecting it through to the school context as well. And also I've not put these links up for self-promotion. I put them up because a lot of the things I'm going to talk through today was done from things I've already written. So things to do with a couple of academic journals, a couple of academic papers I've written for journals, and also some guest blogs that I've written for a number of organisations. So this is hopefully a helpful slide that once the slides are circulated, that people can refer to if you'd like to read around the topic in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I wanted to start with this principle of the science of learning, which I'm sure lots of you will be familiar with, and it's really thinking about the application of cognitive psychology to educational practice, and this term in particular, the science of learning, has become quite popular in recent years, and it's particularly popular in US context. And this technically we could apply this to kind of any kind of educational principle or educational context, but it's really about understanding from a cognitive perspective what principles will support effective learning, and then bring them across into practical context to see how they work in the classroom and also in university settings. And when we think about critical thinking, so critical thinking is definitely researched extensively. So there is a lot of academic research on critical thinking, in particular with this focus on definition. So how do you define critical thinking? And then also links that how do you then measure it, and what kind of learning activities support the development of critical thinking. And that, all of that stuff is great and potentially is really helpful, but it's only really helpful if we can connect it through to educational practice. And when we think about the science of learning, I very much see it as a bi-directional and a collaborative approach, because there is a lot of great stuff in the research literature about critical thinking. I will draw upon some particular examples as we go through this session, but ultimately we're not been able to apply it in educational context, and that is really where we see the gap in, and really understanding from teachers and also understanding from other educational practitioners, like in your particular context, how are these particular principles these principles from research working? Okay, so just this feels perhaps slightly like a cursory question, but I think it's a really important thing to think about, because whenever you're teaching, be it in a university setting or a school setting, there's always going to be a limited amount of time. So essentially we have to make decisions about the kinds of things we want to teach and the kinds of things that we want to prioritize. So this is really kind of a little bit of a plug for why would we focus and why would we spend time on teaching critical thinking. So I suppose the kind of short answer, and perhaps also slightly kind of amusing answer, is that critical thinking has become a little bit of a buzzword. So that everybody is again, especially in a UK and also a US context, they really seem to be talking about critical thinking. And sometimes it's also referred to as a 21st century skill, which I personally don't agree with the term, because critical thinking has been important for a very long time and will continue to be important, but it's got a little bit of a hype around it. In I think because of that, it also just feels like a little bit mystical. So what actually is critical thinking? And in terms of why critical thinking is important, beyond the fact that everybody seems to enjoy talking about it, especially in the media, is that across the board and across countries, teachers are saying that critical thinking in a classroom setting is really very important. So this particular study I've cited is from Latin America, but there are also studies across the UK and US and other countries. which also really highlighting the need in a classroom setting to be able to prioritise and to be able to teach the importance of critical thinking. And also, if we look towards higher education, it certainly is becoming increasingly more important. So, often at universities, and again, especially in the UK context, what we're seeing is that critical thinking is being identified as a strategic priority for the university. So it's not just about teaching at departmental levels, but there's very much a joined up approach in terms of supporting students to become critical thinkers and really taking a whole institutional approach to that. Also, if we then kind of move a step on and we think about employment, so we think about, students go to school and then some students will go on to university and then everybody at some stage will go on to employment. Critical thinking is a really important, it's really important in the workspace, and it's quite interesting because this is studied by the American Association of Colleges and Universities, but again, we also see this come through from the UK context as well, that sort of especially when university graduates are entering the workspace, employers are saying that they're not necessarily equipped or fully equipped with the critical thinking skills that are needed for the work environment, and that I think puts quite an interesting dynamic, because then what you have is you have employers saying to universities, you need to do more to improve critical thinking, and then sometimes you get a knock-on effect with universities and saying to schools, well, you need to do more to improve critical thinking, when actually if we're all agreeing that critical thinking is really important, and I think we are, it really has to be a collective approach, because there's never going to be a point where everybody has, everyone has sort of every single critical thinking skill they need, because as they move through different contexts, they're going to need to be able to transfer their critical thinking skills to different contexts. So that would always be an ongoing process. In really, we can't attribute one institution or one kind of stage of education to teaching critical thinking. It has to be something which is lifelong and which is ongoing. Also, if we just think about some of the kind of academic principles, so critical thinking and developing critical thinking is really important, especially if we think about the spread of sort of just general misinformation and the spread of fake news. If an individual literally read everything that they, everything that they read, that actually is quite dangerous, especially at the moment when you see a whole host of very interesting things in the media. And also just sort of bringing it back to the school context. So a number of studies have shown that if you improve critical thinking, it's also a really strong predictor of academic performance in children. So both primary school children and also secondary school children. And then also, as we're kind of linking it back to this sort of wider life skill, also if you have high levels of critical thinking, you also generally make better life decisions, which I think is doesn't feel too surprising and does seem quite intuitive. So that is a little bit about why critical thinking is important. And what I wanted to do just briefly, and just to sort of get, I suppose, really just to understand your context and your situation a little bit better, is just to open it up for people to put things into the chat, just to give a few reflections about why they think critical thinking is particularly important to their students. So I'll just give people 30 seconds or so to pop some things into the chat, just to do a little bit of a temperature check of the room. Also lovely, and hi, shout out to Emma, who I've just seen has added something in the chat. So yeah, Emma and myself know each other and are both very, very big fans of critical thinking. So thanks so much for joining, Emma. Super. I was going to respond, but I'm just going to wait a few more seconds to see what comes through. I'll just give people sort of 15 more seconds. I always find it very difficult to gauge timings on these things, so just give people a few more seconds. Super stuff. So lots of really interesting things coming through about the importance of transferability, which, you know, I think it's why lots of people teach critical thinking, because it's not just about equipping students and equipping young people to understand a whole bunch of facts about a particular topic, but it's really about supporting individuals so they can then transfer to different contexts. As you know, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, that sort of transfer is a really difficult thing to do. So if you're going to do transfer of anything, and in particular if you're going to do transfer of critical thinking, then it really has to be built in very explicitly. And what I'll do later on is talk you through some examples of activities which will be particularly effective for that. Yeah, and then sort of interestingly, there's wider points about just being able to really sort through all of the kind of array of information that we seem to constantly get bombarded with. Yes, and then also Emma's mentioned the point about metacognition, which I think is a really important one. And often when we talk about critical thinking, it's sort of the term is sort of used interchangeably with metacognition. So really sort of thinking about those self-reflective aspects as well. Okay, lovely stuff. That was super interesting and just very, very helpful context. So yes, I will, as I go through, I'll definitely try and kind of highlight and allude to some of those particular comments. Okay, so we've given a little bit of thought to why we think critical thinking is important, and especially why we think critical thinking is important for young people. So, you know, the next logical step is really, well, what is it? And I think the answer to that is it's not necessarily the easiest of things to define. So this is just a few examples of what I've put in quotation marks standard definitions of critical thinking. So these definitions are taken from the research literature in this, and sort of I put these up sort of mainly to make the point that I don't think these kinds of definitions really help people to practically teach critical thinking. I also teach at a higher education institution. I teach it, but I'm working with undergraduate students. We, you know, of course, like every university, we have certain standards around teaching critical thinking. This wouldn't help me to support people to develop critical thinking and to support students in. You know, I've also asked other people, and sort of the reaction has been quite similar, that this sort of very global, high-level definitions are actually quite difficult in this. And just to draw attention to first definition in particular, this has to be the most widely cited definition in critical thinking research papers. And I feel like I can confidently say that because I've read quite a few now, and basically within the first few sentences, this will be referenced and often quoted in this. And also more broadly, like Peter Pickin does amazing stuff to do with critical thinking research, and clearly you can see from this date has been around for quite some time. But I don't think this definition, I don't think any of these definitions, although they're really helpful in a theoretical context to give sort of an overall impression of critical thinking, it really doesn't then help you sort of take it to a classroom context. So this, I think, just in case it wasn't clear, and just to be really bold, I don't think that these are particularly helpful in practice. So, and I think what this comes back to is this point about the science of learning and really trying to bridge the gap. So if we have academic research happening in one corner and we have teaching happening in the other corner, both doing great things, right, and sort of perhaps overlapping at particular points, but we don't have that consistency across, and we don't have that ongoing and that open dialogue. And this is why things like these definitions aren't really working in educational practice. So really what we need to do is to approach it in a much more connected connected way. And I don't really think I'm saying anything which is particularly mind-blowing. I just think what we've not really sort of worked through yet is really practically how to do that in a consistent way. So I think there's lots of really good examples of it in terms of this bridging across, and especially in the UK and also in the US. I think for critical thinking in particular, probably less so for things like knowledge retention, where I think we've sort of drawn out some of those connections now a bit more concretely. I think critical thinking we do as a collective. I think we need to think a bit more about really how we make those connections. So this is a nice segue on to a piece of research I did that I think is a helpful kind of contribution to this particular topic. And what I wanted to do was really to contribute to this debate to do with really closing the gap between research and teaching practice. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to use established critical thinking definitions from the academic literature. And then I wanted to go to educators. So in particular, I was looking at this in a university context. So asking university instructors how they prioritize different critical thinking skills. And this formed part of a project I did that was funded by the US-UK Fulbright Commission. So I was fortunate to go to America, fortunate to go before the pandemic, just before in 2019. And because of that, it had this sort of UK-US lens. So I was interested in both in the context of US universities and also UK universities. And in terms of the research questions, so I was looking at which critical thinking skills do university instructors prioritize. And I wanted to see whether there were differences across the countries, because as we know, there are some similarities between the UK and the US in terms of teaching practices, especially in a higher education context, but also there are notably some differences. And then also I wanted to understand how critical thinking is being taught in higher education. This was again to really kind of bridge that connection, because there have been, this feels quite a sensible thing to ask people, and so certainly there have been studies previously asking both school teachers and also university instructors how they teach critical thinking or how they define critical thinking. But interestingly, sometimes again, you do get a little bit of that disconnect where it's just without anything really kind of concrete to consider and really concrete to prioritize and really kind of anchor it on some of the research literature and the academic literature. It's a really difficult thing to do. It's like asking somebody a very open question without setting any kind of meaningful parameters. So this research really was just to help to structure that a little bit more. So these are the number of, I call them instructors because in a US context, well, because it was both for a US and a UK context, instructors seem to be like a word that kind of worked and kind of people understood in both contexts. But essentially these are lecturers at sort of, at all universities in sort of teaching positions. In total, so I surveyed 176 faculty staff from 46 institutions. So that was 82 academics from the US and 94 academics from the UK. And also in terms of the focus, so we targeted the humanities and social sciences because we wanted a broad category which consisted of different subjects, but essentially from a consistency perspective, we wanted to have kind of quite a neat broad category. So I don't sadly know what the answers are for STEM. I would love to know if there were differences. I think there probably will be, but certainly for the humanities and social sciences, this is in particular what I'll be speaking to. So I felt the killer question, and probably the question that potentially people can be sort of really critical about is, well, how did you define critical thinking? So what we did in terms of really kind of prepping and putting this survey together was that we, as I've said, kind of our whole sort of thesis was really focusing on the research literature and then identifying key skills and key definitions from the research literature, and then taking both those skills and definitions to university instructors and asking them in the context of the subject, essentially how important were these critical thinking skills, and asking them to rank the critical thinking skills on a scale of 1 to 10, so 1 being most important and 10 being least important. And just to kind of, I suppose, give a little bit of quality assurance to the project. So this, in terms of when we went through the research literature, these were the skills that consistently came up. So I definitely wouldn't be kind of saying there are no other critical thinking skills, because I'm sure we can all think of them, but certainly based on the literature, these were the critical thinking skills that came up the most and that were consistently reported across different papers. And also what we did in terms of the definitions was, again, we looked across a range of papers and we looked for consistency, and then we pulled that together in the context of these definitions. Okay, so the interesting bit, what did we find? So this is an overview of the descriptives. So in terms of from those 176 university instructors, what was the percentage of the number 1 and number 10 rankings? So the number 1 ranking being the most important, and then the number 10 ranking being the least important. In this really, well, really interests me, but also I did find it quite surprising, because before we started to collect the data, I actually thought that the picture might be a little bit more potted. So I didn't think we were necessarily going to see, this really clear distinction in terms of analysis followed by evaluation and interpretation being ranked as most important in those humanities and social sciences subjects. And then equally, we do see a little bit kind of towards the end in terms of the critical thinking skills, which are least important. So this descriptively was a really really interesting in terms of the pattern of data we saw, and really seeing that prioritisation for analysis were just over 40%. So it was 40% of the samples, it was the most important critical thinking skill in their subject. So the question that follows from that is sort of, okay, great, that's the descriptives, but statistically, were the rankings statistically significantly different? And the answer to that is yes. So if we look at overall, we see that analysis, evaluation, and interpretation was significantly more important compared to the other critical thinking skills, and we used explanation as the middle ranked skill. And then equally, in terms of the descriptives, basically it all plays out in terms of the significance levels as well. So we, kind of mirroring what we saw in the figure on the previous slide, creativity, deductive reasoning, description, and problem solving are ranked as relatively ranked as less important. And then if we just do, and this, well, obviously we're thinking about a school setting, so this might be more or less relevant depending if you're sort of teaching in a secondary or teaching in a primary. But this just gives you the subject breakdown, and again, sort of, we really do see quite a consensus in terms of that, the distinction in evaluation, analysis, and interpretation being most important. And equally, we do see a few nuanced differences, particularly when we look at history, and also sort of interesting for philosophy that descriptively we see the same trends, but we don't see a statistically significant difference between the rankings. So that, and that also is just partly probably to do with the particular sample size for the philosophy instructors. And also what we see in terms of country, which also I think again is quite interesting, that we're seeing this level of consistency. So what we see is that if instructors are teaching at a US university, then they are ranking inference as significantly more important compared to instructors in the UK. I put in the definition again because I feel like inference is always one of those things that I have to kind of think about, well, what does it actually mean? So I wanted just to put it back in, to put it back on people's radar. So that was an interesting difference. This was purely a quantitative study, a quantitative survey. So I don't, you know, I have a few hypotheses about qualitatively why there might be some differences, but that is something which we just don't know. We just, you know, I don't know why we see this difference between the US and the UK. You know, it might be possibly to do something with the fact that in the US, critical thinking is more likely to be taught as a standalone subject. And then perhaps, you know, there's just a bit more scope for teaching critical thinking skills, and inference is a particularly difficult critical thinking skill to teach. So perhaps there's something to do with that, sort of just capacity and time. Okay, so this, and I feel like I've been talking for a while, and you're probably thinking, where are the practical tips? Because you said it's going to be a really practical session. So this is my first practical tip, which also implies that there are going to be other practical tips which I'm going to share, which is also factually true. So this is my first practical tip, and I think really for me is the most important thing I can say, which is really think about the context in which you're teaching, think about the subject in which you're teaching. If you're teaching across a range of subjects, try and think about the similarities and differences. Obviously, what we saw in the higher education context is that actually, for humanities and social sciences, there does appear to be sort of quite a high level of similarity across different subjects. So this feels like a really concrete thing to do. And in terms of really doing that prioritisation effectively, I think it's really helpful to draw on the research literature. So again, not to kind of promote this as the complete definitions of everything to do with critical thinking, but certainly based on our research of the literature, it's a really good overview and gives kind of a good steer of kind of the kinds of things that you might want to be thinking through. So that brings us on very nicely to our first poll of the session. So this also, I appreciate that you don't also have the definition. So this is just a little bit of a kind of quick fire exercise, and also hopefully for people not to be too swayed by the results that I just showed them. So just to get a little bit of a sense check from people in the room. Okay, so we just give people a few more seconds. Okay, Aziz, I'm assuming in a minute the lovely results are going to pop up. Okay. Okay, great stuff. So interesting. So we've got we've got analysis as sort of as the most important, followed by evaluation, and then interestingly we then have deductive reasoning. Is that interesting? So that and again, kind of I'm hoping the results didn't kind of sway people too much, but really interesting to see that really critical focus on analysis and evaluation. I think it's particularly important in a school setting, because really that's sort of the basis of critical thinking, and then you can really build on things like creativity, for example, and sort of building on things like problem solving. So that is really interesting to see, and also a number of the activities I'll speak through shortly kind of linked to some of those skills in particular. Okay, so what is the best way to teach critical thinking? I just want to sort of show this very, very briefly. So this again links to the survey that I did with the US and the UK samples. So as I said, in addition to asking university instructors about the prioritisation of critical thinking skills, I also asked them how they were practically teaching critical thinking in their university context. And what I did again was I provided people with set activities and set critical thinking approaches to respond to, which again were taken from the research literature. So so the first sort of question was really just a very general question about whether when teaching, if university instructors highlight the importance of critical thinking. I think it's really reassuring to see that in the majority of the sample do. I think quite interesting to also note that a very small proportion of the sample were unsure as to whether they did, which I actually think is a really fair response, and it's also why we put in the unsure category, because I think sometimes it's actually quite difficult to know if you are teaching critical thinking, because, you know, if you're really focused on the subject content, are you also at the same time implicitly teaching critical thinking? So sometimes that can be quite difficult to unpick. Also, we'll come back to this in a few moments, is that the majority of instructors really adopted an implicit approach. And I'll say a bit more about what the implicit immersion approach is, but essentially they weren't deliberately teaching critical thinking, but they were doing it, they were sort of doing kind of implicitly through their teaching. But then also, interestingly, if sort of, you know, for those kind of critical thinking activities that were happening, really the main thing that the university teachers were using was to do with discussions, and particular discussions in which the teachers were leading those discussions. Okay, so this rapidly brings us on to another poll. So these are the activities that we asked university instructors in the survey. So and there's no right or wrong. These are all actually like very, very good strategies to use. So I just wanted to get a sense in terms of your current practice, what kinds of activities you use to teach critical thinking, and you can select, as I believe you'll be able to select as many activities as you would like. Okay, lovely. So just give people a few more moments. Just give people 15 more seconds and then bring people back together. Okay, so again, and sort of, you know, it's interesting to see the kind of connection through the similarity to the university teachers, but group discussion or / debate led by the teacher seems to be one that is really which is coming out on top. And then the next one would be to do with questions and answers. So this is very interesting. And I think, you know, again, it would be interesting to talk about this at the end when we come onto the general Q&A, but really that discussion around the role of using discussion and using debate to improve critical thinking, but also making sure that it's scaffolded in structured enough that we can make sure that we're taking students with us. So this just sort of comes back to these different approaches that I mentioned earlier. So, and I've tried to be very visual here. So based on the research, this was a study by Abrami and colleagues published in 2008. And they've also released a more recent meta-analysis in 2000, well, relatively recent, 2015. This, I mean, again, kind of after I feel those initial standard definitions, this paper is definitely sort of cited, you know, is one of the most cited papers in terms of critical thinking literature. So this, and it's because it's really helpful, right? So what it's done is it's looked across a range of studies, and it's looked at the effect of these different, the statistical effect of these different approaches in educational context. And I think this is helpful because sometimes there's a conversation about whether critical thinking be best taught as a separate subject. So taught as a general, what we call the general approach. And there's a big debate, right, about general versus subject-specific critical thinking. But essentially, kind of consensus is that it doesn't really work. You have to teach critical thinking within a subject. You know, and it's, again, I feel saying it feels really, really intuitive, but actually it's an important thing, because, you know, there is sort of mixed literature out there. So I think it's helpful to know that really teaching critical thinking in a subject context is the best way to do it. And also it's helpful to know that, you know, we should be making space for critical thinking within, you know, when we're thinking about teaching subject knowledge as well. And sort of really it's this infusion approach that is the most effective. So you teach subject content, and you also teach critical thinking within the context of that subject. If you use the immersion approach, where you don't explicitly refer to critical thinking, you don't set learning objectives to do with critical thinking, you know, kind of like anything, we can't really expect it to increase or to improve. This brings me on to my next tip, which, yeah, it feels quite logical, but I just think it's, you know, kind of sometimes I find the obvious things to say are also the most important. So this really, when you're teaching critical thinking, always thinking about it in that subject context. And if it has to be taught within the subject context, but obviously, and as we've seen, the same critical thinking skills might apply across different subjects or might apply across related subjects. So just, you know, you could be teaching the same skills across subjects, but just think about how those critical thinking skills apply to particular content. Okay, so this I think is perhaps slightly more nuanced, and I think is a really important thing for us to think about. So and again, there's a bit of a debate, right, about in terms of, there's a big kind of link through to Bloom's taxonomy, which is if we're just trying to teach critical thinking, do we have to teach loads of subject knowledge first and then teach the critical thinking? Because do we have to kind of see it as a sequential building block approach, and sort of, you know how it's modelled in particular in Bloom's taxonomy? This was a paper done by Pooja Agarwal in 2019, and again, you might be familiar with her because she does a lot of stuff in the science of learning spaces. She set up an organisation called retrievalpractice.org, and, you know, essentially it's to do with the science of learning and really connecting up some of these cognitive principles to education. And this, so essentially the brief answer is that if you want to improve students' critical thinking, and then you basically need to give them opportunities to practice that, and in particular to use retrieval practice to improve critical thinking. So essentially this study hasn't debunked Bloom's taxonomy, which I actually think is a taxonomy. It's still really quite helpful, but I think it showed us that we haven't got to go sequentially. And just to really reiterate this point, also, as you can see, as we've gone through, I've hyperlinked all of the citations so you can click through. But this study was done both with university students and also with sixth grade school students. And basically, if we just look at the y-axis for the final higher order test, what we see is that the average proportion in terms of the proportion of correct answers on the higher order quiz is much higher than if they're not quizzed. And also, this isn't shown on this graph, but it's also much higher compared to if they're just given factual quizzes. So basically, if you want to improve factual knowledge, you should give people factual quizzes. If you want to improve critical thinking, you should give people critical thinking quizzes. There's also something to be said for using mixed quizzes, so using both factual and critical thinking. But, you know, if we look at the higher order test, and this actually it's quite a small incremental shift. So really sort of focusing on quizzes which are asking questions which are higher order questions will benefit people the most, which brings me on nicely to my third practical tip. Just in total, there are 5 practical tips just to give people a sense of where we're going. So this really shows that we should be doing critical thinking from the very beginning. We should be testing critical thinking from the beginning. Okay, so I'm mindful of time, and also want to give an opportunity for questions as well. So I'm going to talk briefly through some of the activities which are most helpful, why I sort of based on research and based on reading, I think are most helpful. So I'll spend a few minutes doing this, and then I'll hand over to Aziz to give a broader view in terms of the Scholars Programme. Okay, so this, I wanted to give really concrete things because I can say things like you should ask higher order questions, for example, which I definitely encourage, and that also was something which came through in terms of when you were selecting the activity you chose in the classroom. Really using those question prompts and those higher order questions were particularly important. If you're trying to improve a pupil's analysis and evaluation skills, which fortunately lots of you seem to in terms of the from the poll we did earlier, this is a particular activity which it's quite similar to the mind map, but it's sort of bespoke for really thinking through particular arguments, and it's also just noticed it's the only citation I've not hyperlinked. So when I send around the slides afterwards, I will make sure that is hyperlinked before it goes out. But this is really helpful, and although it's a 2009 study, a number of studies have been done since, which show the impact of this both in a school context and in a university context in terms of supporting students' evaluation skills. And it's quite, as you can see, it's quite structured and quite simple, but I think that is part of the kind of beauty of it. So you have a particular issue in the middle, you have particular positions for and against, you support the students to think that through, so you could do a couple of examples yourself, and then you could hand it over to students to think about some different topics. And then in sort of, once they've done that evaluation in the pros and the cons, which sort of also naturally will include a bit of analysis, you get them to do a bit of synthesis, so bringing together the position statement in terms of weighing up the pros and cons for a particular issue. So this, as I say, I think it feels quite simple in some ways, but I think that is kind of the fact it is so kind of structured in scaffolded, and sort of it feels quite concrete for students, I think is really helpful. And as I say, there's a really good research evidence behind this being a particularly effective approach. The other thing to really bring back to this is the idea of retrieval practice, which obviously we've sort of I've briefly spoken through this when we looked at the Bloom taxonomy in the bar chart. But this, like, basically, I don't often think about, or kind of before doing this research, I didn't really think about critical thinking as necessarily being able to do it as a form of retrieval practice. So I've always thought about subject knowledge and retrieval practice and kind of quizzing and kind of doing mini quizzes and things. I've not really, until I've started thinking about this a bit more deeply, I didn't really think about using it for the purpose of higher order thinking and trying to improve higher order skills. So this, again, like isn't kind of revolutionary in terms of like, these are things we're doing all the time when we're teaching both university and also in school context. But I think just having that explicit link to really having some questions and having quite quick questions, and it doesn't actually have to be open-ended, because what Pooja Agarwal shows in her research is that actually you can do it with kind of multiple choice questions. It's just obviously the focus is slightly different in terms of higher order, but it is particularly effective in, again, this using quizzing to improve critical thinking. It's getting kind of more and more kind of coverage and from a research perspective. So this is just to do really with the spacing. So it's not technically an activity, but I think it's a really helpful thing to consider. So and also if we're thinking about this blended approach between subject knowledge and critical thinking, we really need to be thinking about the spacing. So and I think this study, again, kind of a fairly recent study, really demonstrates quite nicely that we need to interweave critical thinking, and we need, so if you're kind of doing one lesson every week versus maths teaching, if you're then asking students to, especially in this kind of comes back to the transfer point, if you're asking students to transfer to a slightly different context, that becomes a really difficult thing to do. So this brings me to my fifth and final tip, which is to model critical thinking. This is kind of a broader point based on the activities I've spoken about, but it's really key to model critical thinking using examples. So really scaffold, say using the argumentation V diagram as an example to kind of model stuff through, and then getting students to really practice these skills in related context with this. And again, I think this is something we think about a lot when we think about subject knowledge. You know, sort of speaking from my own teaching experiences, I think I basically think about critical thinking as like a separate thing. So really, again, kind of bringing it into those contexts is important. This, I won't go through these tips, but this is some other helpful tips, and these aren't my tips. These are tips which I've taken from other academics' research and critical thinking. So again, when I was doing my research in the US, I interviewed a number of critical thinking researchers, and I basically asked them for their top tip. And I wanted to pass the knowledge on and share that with you. And that information will also be in the slides that are circulated after the session. I'm going to move on because I'm also mindful that I'm sort of passing into your time to talk about the Scholars Programme. So this is very briefly to say that critical thinking is one of the key outcomes for our programmes. We have a number of cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes. As much as we can, we teach it explicitly within our programmes because we know, as we've seen from the approaches, it's the most important thing. It's the most effective way, to improve critical thinking. And one way we do that is through a reflection activity, which also links to that metacognition point that some people made earlier. So this, you know, once people have gone through the programme and gone through the development of particular skills, we ask people about how confident they feel, which is we find quite helpful reflection activity. So that also potentially is another activity that people might want to think about in the context of their classrooms. This is just to show that it's working, right? We assess critical thinking through using a standardised mark scheme that we developed in collaboration with academics, and what we see is actually, you know, interestingly, even relative to subject knowledge, critical thinking, we're seeing the biggest percentage change between the baseline and the final assignment, say 22 to 26%, which is very encouraging. Okay, we'll hand over to Aziz.
Thanks so much, Lauren. That's great. And if I can ask you just to move on to the next slide, that would be fantastic. And I think, yeah, really appreciate that kind of hearing more about that research, and I think really how it can inform, you know, the teaching of critical thinking to really kind of help the life chances of young people. And I think what I wanted to do now quickly is just shed a bit of light on our flagship intervention, the Scholars Programme, and really how we support young people to kind of develop those skills, including critical thinking, that are kind of really needed to excel and progress to the next phase of their education. And I think it's always useful to start with, you know, the problem that we're trying to tackle, and namely that, you know, the entrenched and stubbornly persistent link between pupils' backgrounds and their access to higher education, and that inequality is stark, with UCAS kind of confirming that, you know, 1 in 4 of the most advantaged young people end up progressing to highly selective universities, compared to only 1 in 50 from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And it really is our mission to tackle this on inequality and kind of increase the number of pupils from those underrepresented backgrounds progressing to highly selective universities. But how do we do this? Next slide, please, Lauren. Thank you. So namely, it's through our Scholars Programme, which is our flagship intervention, which provides pupils aged from 8 to 18, so Key Stage 2 right the way up to Key Stage 5, the opportunity to kind of work with a PhD researcher and to kind of really experience that kind of university style learning. And it kind of helps them develop the skills, the knowledge, and I think really importantly, the confidence to, you know, not only secure a place at a highly selective university, but also make informed choices about the next phase of their education. And as people alluded to earlier in the presentation, informed choices about their life as well. So as you can see from this programme, which just kind of outlines how we kind of deliver that through the Scholars Programme, and it kind of consists of a range of tutorials that take place within school that are bookended by a launch event and a graduation trip, and these are usually held at highly selective universities. Following that launch trip, kind of each placement is assigned a PhD researcher who will conduct those tutorials in school with pupils, working towards kind of completing a challenging final assessment, a written assessment, and the word count is kind of based on your age, but it ranges from around 2,500 words to around 1,000 words. And that final assessment, based on the area of research that the young people have been studying, is kind of marked and moderated in university grades, and that culminates in that graduation trip. Like I said, usually at a highly selective university, where young people receive firsts and 2-1s, and it's an opportunity to kind of celebrate their kind of input throughout the programme. And they're also kind of signposted to kind of ongoing widening participation opportunities following that. Next slide, please, Lauren. And I think the programme is really brought to life, I think, by the kind of wide array of topics that young people can study. And I think our researchers themselves are kind of drawn from 3 broad pools. So that's STEM, arts and humanities, and social sciences. And I've put up a few course examples here, as I really do think they help bring the programme to life. And also, most importantly, help kind of ignite the imagination of pupils by challenging them to think critically. But I think really importantly, our kind of course content is based outside of the standard curriculum, and it gives young people an opportunity to engage in topics that they may have never kind of come to face with before. Next slide, please. And we celebrate kind of some of the excellent work produced by young people in our termly kind of academic journal called The Scholar, where we publish kind of the university style assignments that are created by our pupils, kind of introducing them to the world of research and kind of peer review. And just so you know, this is accessible on our website, and I just think it's fantastic to see the kind of the output and the quality of work that young people produce on the programme. It really is a fantastic array. Next slide, please, Lauren. But I think it's also obviously really important that there is a clear evidence base for what we do, and the long-term impact of our interventions have kind of been clearly evidenced, and that's kind of through our partnership with UCAS in order to kind of track our graduates. And it's recently been confirmed that for the 5th year running, kind of the data has shown that young people that do take part and graduate in the Scholars Programme are significantly more likely to apply, receive an offer, and ultimately progress to a highly selective university than peers from similar backgrounds. Next slide, please. And I think whilst the impact of our programme, particularly kind of the longer term destinations of our graduates, is obviously extremely important, we also do put a lot of emphasis on developing kind of what we call more intermediate outcomes, kind of based on written communication, subject knowledge, and critical thinking. And again, I think it's really positive that the data consistently shows that pupils make strong improvement from the start to the end of the programme across those competencies. And the way that we do that is kind of through pre and post assessments with young people as well. Next slide, please, Lauren. I'll just skip on to the next one, if that's okay. Fantastic. So how can you get involved? So some of you may already work with our Scholars Programme, which is great. If you would like to find out more information, you can go online onto our website. There's an inquiry form that you can fill out, or you can inquire directly with us. I'll ask my colleague just to post our contact details in the chat, and you can contact us directly to kind of arrange a meeting to discuss how we might best support your pupils going forward. We run programmes termly, so we have our autumn, spring and summer programme. The deadline for signing up to our autumn programme is the end of the summer term, so please do get in contact with us if you would like to explore that in more detail, and we can, like I said, discuss the best range of support for your pupils. I will stop there and just move on to questions. I realise that we are at the hour mark for the presentation. So just like to see if anyone does have any questions on the content of Lauren's presentation related to kind of some of the stuff we discussed around critical thinking, or any questions about the structure of the Scholars Programme. We'd be more than happy to take your questions now. I completely understand if people do need to drop off the call.
And also, just to add in some of I think it's my chattiness, Aziz, that has led us to this point. So if people have to drop off, but you do have a question, then please put it into the chat, and then we can also respond over email. So when we circulate the slides and the recording, which will be shared with everybody afterwards, if you have a burning question but you need to go, which is perfectly understandable, then we can sort of verbally, we can, in a written format, we can respond to the question.
I'll just pick up AJ Hawkins' question here. Are there eligibility criteria for the programme? There is eligibility criteria, and that's to ensure that the programme does meet the needs of young people that need the kind of our programme, those experiences the most. And that is that 55% of any placement, so that's 7 out of the 12 pupils, need to be eligible for or meet one of the following criteria. So either be or have had been eligible for pupil premium, have no parental history of higher education, or be in the lowest third of the postcode deprivation by index, which is something that's searchable online. And we can share more information about that following the presentation. Lauren, there's a question from Miss Buckingham. I don't know if you can see that.
Yes, it's a great question. So I started with higher education. My next step in terms of a project is to look at it across a school context, because, like, you know, obviously we've done a few talks like this now, and actually the analysis and evaluation seem key in a school context, but that is just from kind of doing these sessions. So I would love to really get some quantitative data on this in. Ideally, what I'd love to do is to connect up primary, secondary school education, HE, and also employers to really understand across the board if we get this consistency across different critical thinking skills. I'd also really like to, I mainly looked at it in a humanities and social sciences context. I'd love to see if there were differences for STEM. I think there probably would be. So I think there's, I suppose very short answers that I would no, but I would love to find out, and that's sort of the next thing which we're planning in terms of taking this further.
There's a question there. Could you tell us about any research of critical thinking that's linked to STEM subjects?
So there is quite a lot of research on STEM and critical thinking, and often, so basically, critical thinking research tends to be done with psychology students. So there's a lot of stuff on social sciences, psychology. There's also quite a lot done in the context of medicine and nursing, which obviously is a slightly different context of thinking about it, thinking about STEM in a school context. So that's a few papers. So if it would be helpful when we send around the resources, I can also send around a couple of papers just to signpost. In terms of thinking about it in a STEM context, there's quite a lot of discussions to do with problem-based learning. So really thinking about discovery methods of learning to support critical thinking. So broadly, my take on it is that critical thinking, as we know, is a really difficult thing to do. So it's not that we shouldn't use problem-based learning, but if you're going to use it, it has to be really structured. You have to apply the same principles, right? So you have to use examples. You then have to give pupils related examples and things to work through with, you know, structured with higher order questions, for example. You then need to give them retrieval practice. So I think a lot of stuff we've spoken about kind of transfer across, but I think sort of really making sure we fully understand the context, and obviously those critical thinking skills are particularly important. But I've got a few papers in mind, so I will send those around as part of this follow-up.
Thanks. Yeah. I think those are all the questions.
Aziz, I'm not sure we can hear you a bit. It's a bit quiet.
Oh, right.
You're back for me. I don't know how everyone else found that, but yeah, you're back.
Oh, right. Sorry, maybe I was whispering too quietly. I was just thinking, I think that's all of the questions that have been posted for the moment. So I'll give it a moment or two longer just to see. But I think what we can do is obviously send round a kind of PDF copy of the slides along with the feedback form as well. And I'm sure if there are any kind of additional questions that people can get in touch that way.